Hey, what you reading for?
So I just finished reading The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. This is a book that has been getting a lot of love on BookTube, especially the horror BookTube. People are praising it, celebrating it as a masterpiece. And I am glad. I am glad that so many people love it. I do not feel like we live in a world that suffers from an overabundance of love. So if people are loving something, I am not going to be the one to try to stop them from loving. Unfortunately, I myself cannot jump on this love train. I didn't love the book. I didn't hate it either. It's not a bad book. It's not particularly great either. It's okay. It is billed as a historical fiction horror. I didn't think it really was a horror book. I mean, there are some supernatural elements, but they're not those elements that cause the threat. And for me, horror is when we're confronted with the unknown that is the source of terror. But here, there are ghosts in this book, but in this world, everybody in this town experiences ghosts when they're children, so this is not an unknown factor, and it's not even a threat. The threat comes from the racism and the corruption between the people. So I would not consider it really a horror book. It plays out more like a drama. And as for historical fiction, it's set in Florida in the 1960s, so Jim Crow Florida with the segregation. And for me, when I read historical fiction, I am expecting a very immersive experience. I want to be placed, or I expect to be placed in that setting, almost as if I'm reading a book that was written at that time. The Reformatory very much reads like a contemporary book. It reads like a book that was written today, and it just tells a story taking place in the 1960s, which isn't bad in and of itself. It's just not what I want in historical fiction. When I first heard of this book, The Reformatory, I think I was doing a TBR video like months ago when I first heard of this book, and I passed on it because there was nothing in the synopsis that appealed to me. Firstly, it's a ghost story, and ghosts do not interest me at all. And also, it takes place in the Jim Crow South. So this is in the South of the United States with the segregation and racism and injustice. It's just really ugly period and setting, and I just don't want to spend any time in that ugliness. So I understand that it happened. It's part of the history, and we need to understand it. We need to be aware of it. I get that, and I get the importance of it. It's just that I don't want to spend any time in that ugliness. So that's what put me off to reading the book. But because it had been getting so much buzz and so much love on BookTube, that's why I finally decided to go against my reservations and read it. And it's not a short book either. It's 580 pages. And I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. I took my time with it. I think it took me almost 2 months to read this book. I just read like 10, 15 pages a day, because I wasn't really into it, but I did want to finish it, so I took my time. And because I cannot recommend it personally with a high degree of enthusiasm, instead, I'm going to pick 4 historical fiction horror books that I can recommend with enthusiasm. And all 4 of these books I have talked about in various videos, so I'll keep it brief here and refer you to these other videos if you're interested. But for our historical fiction horror, we'll start with The Night of the Hunter by Davis Grubb. And this takes place during the Great Depression on the Ohio River. So this is like 1930s, right? And it's basically a man called the Preacher who is chasing these two orphan kids because he wants to catch them and probably hurt them. And it's kind of like the Terminator meets the Grapes of Wrath, that kind of thing. This book doesn't have supernatural elements either, except we are given passages, we are given the perspective of the young boy, so with the way he sees the world and such that shadows come alive and that kind of thing. So it doesn't have supernatural elements to it, but it does use poetic language that implies that it has more of a horror feel than at least the Reformatory did, in my opinion. But it is gorgeously written, and it's a tense page turner. Staying in America, we have Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. This takes place in pre-Civil War times, so this is early 19th century, early to mid 19th century, on the Mississippi River with vampires steamboat racing on the Mississippi River. And I thought this was excellent. It was very immersive. I felt like I was really there operating a steamboat in the 19th century. I'm not really a fan of vampires, and I didn't know anything about steamboats. But as I was reading the book, I got really into steamboats, and I got really invested in the steamboat racing. So I'm not a big vampire fan, but I am a steamboat fan, thanks to this book. This was a lot of fun, and it's definitely an immersive experience, so I quite enjoyed it. And if you like vampires, bonus points for vampires, right? Also, I can also recommend with great enthusiasm the first two books from Catriona Ward. Her first book was Raw Blood, which takes place mostly in the 19th century, although there is a timeline in the 20th century. Multiple POVs, multiple timelines. I mean, she writes for this scared, lonely child in the 19th century. She writes for two researchers in the 19th century who are involved in some pretty gruesome experiments in the name of science. And then she writes for a young man in the early 20th century who's losing his mind. It's super impressive on a technical level from the craftsmanship. It's super impressive. I'll be honest with you, when I was reading this book, Raw Blood, I struggled with it because I had a difficult time following the story. And it wasn't until the end, like the last few pages, maybe the last page, where it just clicked on me and wow. And it was, my mind was blown. For a more accessible Catriona Ward book, her second book is also historical fiction, Little Eve, and this one is set on an island off the coast of Scotland, and it deals with a cult leader, this man who has a cult with women and young girls, and it's pretty gruesome, pretty disturbing premise. We begin with what is probably a mass suicide or a mass execution. We're not sure. And we think that one girl escaped, or maybe two girls escaped, or maybe three girls escaped. We don't know that much about the cult because they did live separated from society. But we know that somebody escaped, and we don't know if there are other girls at large. We're not really sure what exactly happened. Was it a mass suicide? Was it a mass execution? So there is a mystery element to this, and it takes place at the turn of the century, or the early part of the 20th century. And one of the girls, the escapee from the cult, she befriends a man who claims that he is a detective. And he tries to engage with her about the cult, and he tries to explain to her that the tricks that the cult leader used were just parlor tricks, and he doesn't really have powers. There isn't really a power, that the cult really wasn't real. It's all a sham. So that part was super interesting because it took the supernatural elements and then brought in critical thinking into the equation, which was interesting. Grim, dark, disturbing book because of the subject matter. We're talking about cults and a mass killing, but also super interesting. So there you have it, 4 historical fiction horror books that I absolutely loved. Unfortunately, the Reformatory doesn't make the list. I did not absolutely love that one. It was okay. I'm thinking in a few months I will have completely forgotten about it because it really didn't do much for me. It didn't provide an immersive experience. It didn't really provide a scary experience, and it didn't really do anything particularly creative or inventive. Yeah, wasn't bad though. It wasn't bad, but hard for me to be enthusiastic. Maybe next time. Do you have any experience with the books I talked about in this video? Or do you have a recommendation for a historical fiction / horror book? I love connecting with you in the comments section. Please don't hate me for not loving the Reformatory. I did try to love it, but I failed to love. Who's shocked to hear that? It is what it is. Maybe next time, right? Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.